Welcome to our satsang this morning. It's good to be with all of you. As you've heard, in many parts of Minnesota, we had the first snow. This is a bit late for us, but many people welcome the snow, especially those who participate in all of the winter sports. So we begin this morning continuing our study together of the Vibhishan Gita. This is found in the Ramacharitamanas of Goswami Tulsidas. But I begin, as I always do, with words and verses of prayer. And these verses that I'm using for this series of classes are verses composed by Sant Tulsidas himself. These are words of prayer to begin our study together this morning. He begins with a prayer to God in the form of Goddess Saraswati and Ganesha, so that the words that we speak this morning, the words that we hear, may convey truth and meaning. Varnanam artha sanganam. Varnanam artha sanganam. Rasanam chandasam api. Mangalanam chakartarau. Vande vani vinayakau. And then Sant Tulsidas prays to the divine in the form of Shiva and Bhavani, Shankara, that we will listen with receptive minds, Shraddha, Vishwasa, Rupinau. Bhavani, Shankarau, Vande, Shraddha, Vishwasa, Rupinau. Yabhyam vina na pashyanti siddha swanta tamishwaram. And to the gurus of our spiritual traditions whose teachings bless us and who have preserved these teachings that we share today. Vande bodhamayam nityam Gurum Shankara Rupinam Yamasrito Hivakropi Chandra Sarvatra Vandyate. And to God in the form of Shri Rama and Sita, in the context of whose life story we have the Vibhishan Gita. And here he also pays tribute to the first author of Ramayana, Valmiki himself. Sita Rama Gunagramam Punyaranya Viharinau Vande Vishuddha Vijnanau Kavishwara Kapishwarau Udbhava Sthiti Samhara Karinim Kleshaharinim Sarvasreyasya Karim Sitam Natoham Rama Vallabham Neelambujashamalako Malangam Sita Samaropitavam Bhagyam Panau Mahasayaka Charuchapam Namami Ramam Raghuvam Shanatam Ramaya Ramabhadraya Ramachandraya Vedhase Raghunathaya Nathaya Sitaya Pataye Nama. As we begin our study today, I want to hold, especially in our hearts and in our prayers, those who have always been part of our study together, but who are unable to join us because of health struggles and health challenges. I remember all of them this morning and pray for God's grace and for God's blessings of strength and healing to them all. So we continue with our discussion of Vibhishan Gita. In this beautiful series of verses in the Ramayana, Sant Tulsidas uses the chariot of war, the Dharma Yuddha, to speak instead of the chariot of virtue, the Dharma Yuddha. And he associates each part of the chariot with a very central virtue for our spiritual lives. So as we saw last week, no chariot moves without wheels. The structure itself rests on wheels. And the chariots in those days had two, not four wheels. So he names the two wheels of this chariot as Sauraj and Dhiraj. Sauraja Dhiraja Tehiratha Chaka. Sauraj is bravery, courage, valor, and Dhiraj is resilience, patience, persistence, fortitude. These are the two wheels of the chariot. Satyashila Drida Dvaja Pataka. And what are the flags of the chariot, Dvaja? He says these are truth, Satya, and Shila, integrity. And even as flags identified warriors on the field of battle, the teacher here is suggesting that truth and integrity ought to be our markers, the flags of our lives for which we are known and identified. Satya, Shila, Drida, Dvaja, Pataka. And what are the four horses, the four noble horses of the chariot? Bala Bibeka Dama Parahita Ghore. He names as the four horses. Bala, strength, but in this case, particularly Dharma Bala, moral strength, commitment to moral, ethical values. And then the second is Viveka. Viveka is the Awadhi version of the Sanskrit Viveka, which we discussed. Viveka is discernment, especially the ability to discern between that which is finite and that which is eternal, Nitya and Anitya. So Viveka is defined as Nitya Anitya Vastu Viveka, telling the difference, knowing the difference between that which is finite and that which is eternal, that which passes away and that which does not pass away. What is important ultimately and what is important in a more limited sense. So Bala Viveka, and then the third is Dhamma. Dhamma is self-control, especially control of the sense organs, Gyan Indriyas, as we say in Sanskrit, and organs of action, Karma Indriyas. So acting mindfully about one's words, one's actions would be Dhamma. And we discussed, the close relationship that always exists between Shama and Dhamma. These are always paired together. So Shama is control of the mind. Mano Nigraha is defined as Shama, and then Dhamma is Chakshuradi Bahya Indriya Nigraha, control of the organs of action and the sense organs. So in so many ways, Dhamma flows from Shama, or control of the mind. So Bala, Viveka, Dhamma, and the final horse is Parahita. It's a very beautiful addition to the list. Parahita is commitment to the well-being of others. Commitment to the well-being of others is Parahita. In other words, virtues like moral strength, control of the senses, control of the organs of actions, must not stop as inward virtues. We must also look outward. They must be outward oriented, and outward oriented in terms of parahita, in care and compassion for others. So spirituality has these two dimensions: inward transformation, but also expressing that inward transformation in a life of compassion for others. So these are the four horses. And what are the reins of the chariot that we discussed? He said, Sant Tulsidas said, Kshama, Kripa, Samata, Rajujore. These are the three reins. And as I discussed before, in these ancient chariots, there are four horses, but three reins, because the horses on the front had independent reins, two reins, and then the horses at the back followed the ones in front. So they were controlled by one rein. So what are the three reins of the chariots? He says the first is Shama. Shama, forgiveness. Shama, as we discussed, is not condoning or encouraging that which is manifestly wrong or immoral, but learning to see wrong action as having roots in a deeper source, in our own tradition, in avidya, in ignorance. And therefore, even though we have to resist wrongdoing, yet we can also be compassionate to the wrongdoer. And this is called Shama. So Shama, which is this deep understanding, we discussed this before, deeper looking into the causes of wrong action, expresses itself in Kripa. Two beautiful words, Shama and Kripa. Shama, forgiveness; Kripa, compassion. Shama and Kripa. And these two values, Kshama, forgiveness, and Kripa, naturally express themselves in Samata. So one who is endowed with the virtue of forgiveness and compassion is also Samata, is also collected, is also enjoys a certain emotional and mental balance and stability, which is discussed here and described in the word Samata, which is the third rein. In the Bhagavad Gita, we have that beautiful line, Samatvam Yoga Uchyate, that the heart of yoga, the essence of yoga, is Samatvam, this serenity of balance that comes as a result of the richness of forgiveness and compassion in the individual life. So we learned about the flag, about the wheels of the chariot. We've learned about the flags of the chariot. We learned about the horses of the chariot, and we learned about the reins of the chariot. So next is, who is the charioter? He describes beautifully other parts of the chariot, beginning with the charioter. So these are the verses these are the lines we will discuss today. Isha bhajanu sarathi sujana virati charma santosha kripana. Isha bhajanu sarathi sujana virati charma santosha kripana. दान परसु बुद्धि शक्ति प्रचंडा बर विज्ञान कठिन कोदंडा. दान परसु बुद्धि शक्ति प्रचंडा बर विज्ञान कठिन कोदंडा. ईश भजनु सारथी sujana. Very beautifully put by Tulsidas. Who is the charioter? And here he says, Isha. Isha bhajanu sarathi sujana. Sarathi is the charioter. Sujana, intelligent. Who is the intelligent charioter? He says, Isha. Ishwara.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Ishvara is the Lord. So devotion or love of God, Isha Bhajanu, is the intelligent charioteer. Isha Bhajanu Sarathi Sujana. When we met on the last occasion, we were talking a little bit about the Katha Upanishad and the use of the chariot analogy in Katha Upanishad, which is the earliest mention that we have of this metaphor in the Hindu sacred text. I think it was Nayana, if she's here, who reminded us of the example of the chariot in the Katha Upanishad. And there, of course, you have that very beautiful verse, Atmanam Rathinam Vidhi, Shariram Ratham Evacha, Buddhi tu Sarati Vidhi, Mana Pragya Hamevacha, Atmanam Rathinam. So in this verse, the teacher in the Katha Upanishad says, Atmanam Rathinam. Know the Atma, the self, as the one, as the Lord of the chariot. That's the one seated in the chariot, not the charioteer, but the one seated on the chariot. Atmanam Rathinam Vidhi, Shariram Ratham Evacha. So the body, Sharira, is the chariot. The body is the chariot. Shariram Ratha. And who is seated in the chariot? Atma. The Atma is the one seated in the chariot. Who is the charioteer in Katha Upanishad? Buddhi tu Sarathi Vidhi. The Buddhi, reason, intelligence, is the charioteer. Buddhim tu Sarathim Vidhi. Mana Pragya Hamevacha. And the mind, Manaha, is the reins. And the Katha Upanishad goes on to develop this analogy. The horses become the sense organs and so on and so forth. In the Bhagavad Gita, you remember very well, who is the charioteer? Sarathi, who is Arjuna's charioteer? Sri Krishna himself is the charioteer. So perhaps here Sant Tulsidas is picking up certainly from the Bhagavad Gita and speaking of Ishvara, Isha, God as the charioteer. So here he describes charioteer, but he says Isha Bhajanu, not simply Ishvara or Isha, but we must look at the words carefully. Ishvara or Isha Bhajanu, Sarathi Sujana, Isha Bhajanu. He qualifies it by saying that it's a love of God. Ishvara, Isha Bhajanu, not simply Isha, but Isha Bhajanu. Deep love for God is the charioteer, is the Sarathi. So the charioteer is the one who is responsible for guiding the chariot in the midst of battle, ensuring safety, ensuring success. In this case, of course, we're speaking about the battle of life itself. But Ishvara does not become our charioteer, our Sarathi, unless we invite Ishvara to be the charioteer. It is not a natural process. And I think this is the deep point of that famous incident in Mahabharata that you may be familiar with. When both Arjuna and Duryodhana approached Sri Krishna for his help on the eve of the Mahabharata Yuddha, on the eve of the Mahabharata war. And as you would remember, there was Duryodhana was given the first choice. Now, Sri Krishna offered this choice to them both. You could have, some of the divisions of my army, some of my best army divisions, or you could have me unarmed on the battlefield as your charioter. And Duryodhana chose first, as you will recall, and he opted for the armies, the divisions of Sri Krishna, wondering, thinking that it would be fairly useless to have Sri Krishna on the battlefield and unarmed Sri Krishna as his charioter. And Arjuna, of course, chose Sri Krishna. But I think the point of that story, the deeper theological point, is what it means to have Ishvara, Isha Bhajanu Sarati Sujan, to have Ishvara as one's life charioter. What does it mean to have God or Ishvara as one's charioter? And as I said, Tulsidas is quite specific here. He doesn't simply say Isha as one's charioter, but he says Isha Bhajanu, love for the divine, love for God as the intelligent, Sarati Sujana. So then the question as we study, this line in Vibhishan Gita for all of us is, how does Isha Bhajanu, love for the divine, love for God, bhakti, Ishvara bhakti, how does this love become the intelligent charioter, Sarati Sujana? And I understand and I believe that this happens when the love of God, Isha Bhajanu, Ishvara Bhajana, Ishvara Bhakti, when this love, and this love also presumes some understanding of the nature of the divine, of God. So this love also carries with it jnana, or knowledge, because we can't love something that we don't know, something that we don't have some understanding of. So when this love of God, Isha Bhajanu, unites with Ishvara Jnana, or understanding of the divine, understanding of God, and when this unity of Jnana and Bhakti, love and knowledge, become the basis for making choices and decisions in life. So on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, Sri Krishna determined the positions of Arjuna's chariot as the charioter. He surveyed the battlefield and he helped Arjuna make decisions about where the chariot should be positioned or not positioned. So when the love of God becomes the basis for making choices and decisions in life, then Ishvara becomes the intelligent Sarati Sujana. So in making decisions in life, this is what we must ask ourselves: how is the love of God or the knowledge of God that we have, how do these become important factors that we take into consideration in making choices, in making decisions? How do these influence us? And do they influence us? And if so, how do these influence us? Our sacred texts like Bhagavad Gita and, we're studying Ramacharitamanas give us many directions. So let me just make some suggestions about what this means. So in Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna uses at least twice the expression Loka Sangraha, the public good, the common good. I prefer to translate it as the universal common good, not the common good of a particular community or a particular nation, but Loka. Loka is a very inclusive word. It refers to the entire universe. So Loka Sangraha is the universal common good. So in the Bhagavad Gita, in the teachings of Sri Krishna, commitment to God, commitment to a life that is centered on the divine, commitment to spirituality means that the good of others, in this case, the universal common good, must always be in one's radar. In all of the choices that one makes, one has to consider the impact of these choices on others. How are my decisions affecting the well-being of others? In all that one does, he says, one should consider the common good. So if we make decisions on the basis of Isha Bhajanu, as in Sant Tulsidas' words, we would always think of the impact of our choices on others. And in our Hindu tradition, others also include the planet itself, the earth itself. It's not, as we say, in more technical, theological language, it is not anthropocentric. It is not centered only on the well-being of human beings. It is centered on the well-being of all. Loka Sangraha, as I said, is inclusive. It includes all. Since we are studying, these verses from Sant Tulsidas text, it is good also to look at what Isha Bhajanu means for him. How does Isha Bhajanu, or love of God, becomes the Sarathi for him? And he gives us so many examples. There are so many beautiful words that he uses in this text to describe the implications of love of God for our lives. One of my favorites is when he says, Rama Bhagata Parahita Nirata Paradukha Dukhi Dayal. Those who love God, and we always have to translate that word Rama as God, as divine. Rama Bhagata, the lover of God. Parahita Nirata. It comes back in that verse. He uses again that word Parahita. The lover of God is always devoted to the well-being of others. Parahita Nirata. Always Nirata, constantly devoted to the well-being of others. Paradukha Dukhi Dayal. And suffers when others suffer. Dayal. Is compassionate and suffers when others suffer. That's one beautiful line that he uses. Ram Bhagata Parahita Nirata Paradukha Dukhi Dayal. And then he says at another place in his text, Jinahi Rama Tumha Prana Pyare. Those for whom God, his term for God, as you know, is Ram, or Siya Ram. Jinahi Rama Tumha Prana Pyare. Those for whom God is as dear as life itself. The expression it uses, Prana Pyare. Prana is the life breath. Those for whom God is as dear as life itself, or as dear as the breath of life itself. How do they live in this world? Jinahi Ram Tumha Prana Pyare Sabake Priya. They love all. See how it follows? Those for whom God is the breath of life, as dear as life itself, they sabake priya, they love all, and that love is active. Sabake priya, sabake hitakari. They love all and are devoted to the well-being of all. They delight when others succeed. Jai harashi parasampati dekhi. They are happy when others are well. dukhita hoi para vipati visheshi, and they experience unhappiness when others are unhappy. They are lovers of all. And one final verse from Tulsidas, these are among my favorite. Umaje Ramacharitamanas. Those who are devoted to the feet of God, Ram Charan Rata, Vigata Kam Madha Krodh. They are free from greed and free from hate. So these are ways in which, the author himself, Sant Tulsidas, specifies what this Rama Bhajanu means and how it informs how this love can become a charioter, how it guides the values that we derive from it that become the guiding principles for life in our world. As I read this, there was one final thought that I had. I'm sure I'll have more thoughts as I read it again and again. This line, Isha Bhajanu Sarathi Sujana. One would think, these are 4 words that you may say, Isha Bhajanu, love of God, is the charioter, is love of God. But then he adds the word Sujana, intelligent charioter. So I paused there and I was asking myself, why would Tulsidas qualify or add or amplify this line by adding Sujana, the intelligent charioter? And my thought is that we see so much in our world examples of, I would have to say, so-called, I hope that's fair, so-called love of God or devotion to God leading to irrational action. In other words, the love of God should not be separate from the exercise of intelligence, from the exercise of reason. It is not opposed to reason. We should not bifurcate these two, bhakti and jnana, love and wisdom. They must always be paired. If not, it is always possible that we can fall into the trap of doing irrational things or irrational actions in the name of the divine. Something that we see so much, I think, in our world today. So Isha Bhajanu Sarathi Sujana. Love of God is the intelligent charioter. What leaves us, I think, with that question that we all have to ask ourselves: how are my choices in life being informed by my love of God? Because if my love of God does not inform my choices in life or influence the decisions that I make, what does it really mean for me? It is no longer my charioter. It is not a guiding influence. Let's put it in that way. It is not a guiding influence in what I do. And then he asks, what is the shield that the warrior holds? So the charioter is the love of God. Every warrior has a shield, a protective shield. What is the protective shield of the warrior on the chariot of virtue? We always have to remember that. We're describing the Dharma Ratha, the chariot of virtue. And here he says, Virati Charma. Virati Charma. So the charma, which means the shield, which protects one from harm. This is the role of the shield. The shield is not usually a weapon of aggression. It is you protect yourself from weapons that are directed towards you by wielding a shield, charma. So he says that this shield is, the word he uses here, virati charma. Virati is the same as in Sanskrit, vairagya. Virati is vairagya. So these are synonyms. Virati is vairagya. we encountered this word vairagya, or at least we talked a little about the meaning of vairagya earlier, and we've certainly encountered it in many satsangs. Vairagya has a special relationship to one of the qualities that we saw earlier, which is viveka. These are always paired together, like shama and dhamma that we saw, viveka and vairagya like two wings, the wings of a bird. They go together. So viveka is defined as the discernment, as I said before. We saw that is defined as, in Sanskrit, as nitya anitya vastu viveka. Discerning, or the intelligence through which we can discern the difference between those things that are anitya, are finite, temporary, non-lasting, and those things that are nitya, lasting, eternal, infinite, that does not change or diminish with time. So telling the difference, nitya and anitya vastu, is called viveka. Viveka. And so vairagya, which is what he identifies here as the shield, he uses the word virati, virati charma, the shield is vairagya. Vairagya follows logically from viveka. So vairagya is the effect on our wills, the effect on us mentally and emotionally of understanding the difference between the finite and the infinite, nitya and anitya. It follows from the understanding that the finite, as necessary as it is not that we can do without things that are finite. We need the finite goals, finite ends in our lives. But at the heart of vairagya is the understanding of the limitations of those things that are finite. They will always leave us with a sense of want, leave us incomplete. Therefore, understanding that we free ourselves from, not from need, we always have needs, but we free ourselves from greed. Vairagya is the freedom from greed that follows viveka. Thus, if we are imbued with vairagya, we are always moderate and wise in our approach to those things that are finite. And in this sense, vairagya becomes a protective shield. It protects us from the suffering of not being realistic about finite things. It is the same as Sri Krishna taught, in Bhagavad Gita, in that beautiful verse, Yahi samsparshaja bhoga dukkhayonaya evate. And here he's speaking again about vairagya and viveka. Adyanta vanta kaunteya. Things that are finite have adi and anta. They have a beginning and an end. Nateshu ramate buddha. Therefore, don't become subject to greed for those things that are finite. We need the finite. What we have to free ourselves from is the condition of greed. I spoke earlier about the Katha Upanishad, the use of the chariot analogy in the Katha Upanishad, but also later on we have that very beautiful line in Katha Upanishad from the lips of this young man, Nachiketa, where he says to Yama, who is his teacher, Navittena tarpaniyo manushyo. He says that I understand, I need wealth, but navittena, vitta is wealth, navittena tarpaniyo manushya. But I also know that the human being will not be satisfied with wealth. Wealth would leave every human being wanting more. Navittena tarpaniyo manushya. That knowledge is both viveka, and viveka leads to Vairagya. Vairagya is not running away from the world. Vairagya is living in the world with the exercise of viveka, living in the world without greed. So if Vairagya, or in Tulsidas's word, virati, is the shield, what are the weapons? We haven't discussed any weapons yet. What are the weapons that are wielded by a warrior in the chariot of virtue? What is the sword, kripana, in the hands of the warrior? What is the sword that the warrior wields? And here he says, virati charma, santosha kripana. So the shield is vairagya or virati. What is the sword? And he gives a very beautiful answer for what is the kirpan. He says, kripana, the sword. The sword is contentment. He uses the beautiful word, santosha. Virati charma santosha kripana. Contentment is the sword. How does contentment become a sword? Santosha. As we read these verses, it's also insightful to look at the sequence and how he moves from virtue to virtue in these poetic lines. So he just spoke about vairagya or virati as the shield. And then santosha follows vairagya. Contentment follows vairagya. Because since vairagya, as we've just discussed, since understanding the limits of the finite, anitya, frees us from greed for the finite, then when we are liberated from greed, then that condition is called santosha. That condition of freedom from greed is contentedness, santosha. We all have wants, but greed is not a natural condition. As I said, in relation to the finite, the problem is not need. We all have needs as long as we live on this earth. The problem is greed. And the beautiful word santosha describes this condition of freedom from greed. But why is the sword the appropriate weapon to use here in speaking about contentment? The sword is a weapon of violence. It may be used to inflict pain and suffering on others. And as I said, viveka leads to vairagya, and viveka and vairagya blossoms in santosha. Contentment, which is the same as freedom from greed. So a person, think of it in this way, a person who is caught in the grip of greed, a person who lacks viveka and vairagya, becomes like a sword to others. Is capable of hurting others, likely to cause pain and hurt to others. But when santosha becomes your sword, it protects both you and others. In other words, you do not become a source of suffering to others when santosh is your sword. Let me explain by giving an example from Bhagavad Gita. So in the 16th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, you can go and look at the verses 13 to 15. Sri Krishna gives a very detailed and a very powerful description of a person who lacks viveka, the ability to distinguish between the finite and the infinite, and as a consequence of that is a victim of greed. how does such a person behave in this world? How does such a person become a threat to others? And he does it by actually going into the psychology of such a person. Idam adya maya labdham, idam prapsyase manoratham. This is how such a person, Sri Krishna says, thinks. Idam adya maya labdham. I have gained so much wealth today, and I want more. Imam prapsyase manoratham. Is always thinking of what more I should gain. Idam astidam apime bhavishyati punardhanam. This is mine, and tomorrow I shall have even more. Asau maya hata shatru. I have destroyed this one. In this process, I have destroyed this person, rejoicing in the destruction of the other. Asau maya hata shatru. Hanishye chaparam api. And these are the others that I will destroy. Always thinking of who to destroy. Ishwaroham. I am great. Ishwaroham. I am like God himself. Aham bhogi. I am the enjoyer. I am perfect. Siddhoham. Balavan sukhi. I am the strongest. Adhyo bhijanavan asmi ko yasti sadrisho maya. Who else? Who is there in this world equal to me? This is the psychology of the person who's without santosha and a victim of viveka and vairagya. And such a person is always a danger to the well-being of others. But the sword of santosha protects both the person who wields it, but the sword is not a threat to others because such a person is free from greed. Virati charma santosha kripana. What a beautiful line. That vairagya is the shield and contentment, the sword. And what is the axe? Parasu. So this warrior has, on that chariot, there is a lot of weapons. What is the axe of the warrior on the chariot of virtue? Dharmaratha. Dan parasu buddhi sakti prachanda. Interesting. The parasu is, he says, generosity, giving, dhanam. Dana parasu, the axe is generosity, the willingness to share. And it follows again. See the logical connection. One, santosha is contentment. And then what follows santosha? Dana. One who is contented has the disposition of generosity. One who is not content, as we saw in the Bhagavad Gita verses, always wants more. In the psychology of the person described there by Krishna, there is no generosity. There is self-centeredness. There is the will and the urge to accumulate. But in the person who is rich in santosha, the person is also rich in dana, in generosity. So dana becomes the axe, dan parasu. In fact, later in Ramayana, Tulsidas says that there are 4 pillars of virtue. And he names these as truth, satya, compassion, daya, tapas, self-control, and dana, generosity, sharing, disposition. Satya, daya, tapas, dana. And then he adds, he says that in my own times, in these times, he says, when he's writing, he says, I regard dana to be preeminent. And I was thinking about this, why would Tulsidas say that, satya, daya, tapas, and dana, but dana is preeminent. And my own thought is that dana is the act. Dana is the active expression of truth, compassion, and self-control. Dana is the virtue that speaks about one's relationship to others, because one can't say, Danavan asmi, I am a generous person, if one doesn't give. So dana is an active expression of truth, of self-control, of compassion. So Tulsidas regards it as preeminent, as the expression, I would say, the fulfillment of truth, compassion, and self-control. And when we think about it, so much suffering in our world, so much dukkha in our world could be alleviated by more generosity. Dhanam ensures that virtues always flow outwards and express themselves in relationship with others. To practice dhanam is to be a giver and a receiver. We are all receivers. We can't choose in life whether we are receivers or not. The Vedas describe us all as indebted beings, as born into debt. And that means, because we are constantly receiving. At this very moment, we're not always aware of it. We are receiving life from the air that we breathe. We are pranis. We live because we breathe. We can't exist without being receivers. We do not choose to be receivers, but we can choose whether we are givers. And the Hindu ideal is to be both a receiver and a giver, to practice dhanam. Just as a small aside about the Hindu tradition, dhanam and dakshina are different. Dakshina is giving in the context of a religious ritual. So when a priest performs a religious ritual in our tradition, we reward the priest with dakshina. That gift to the priest is called dakshina. So dakshina is that which is given in the context of a ritual. Dhanam has no such restriction. Dhanam is that which we give to anyone in need. Let me just give you an example of what dhanam can mean. If the billionaires in our world gave 1% of their net worth each year as dhanam, just 1% of their net worth each year as dhanam, this dhanam could ensure access to healthcare and education for all the poorest children across our globe. 1% each year would wipe out poverty and illiteracy in our world. And their wealth would hardly be diminished. That's the kind of impact that the dhanam can have. Instead of, I think as I think more and more, and as I read this beautiful discussion here by Tulsidas, the message that I am hearing is how different our world will be if we would replace weapons of war with weapons of virtue, if I were to use the word weapons in relation to virtue. What a difference it would mean. Instead of distributing weapons of war, we were more generous with the wealth that could eliminate diseases, the wealth that can eliminate illiteracy. These virtues speak to us personally, but I think here we can certainly say that these virtues have international significance. We can extend the meaning of this entire discussion to international relations. How should countries relate to each other? Some of you might, those of you who are familiar with the Christian tradition and Jewish tradition, because it comes from Hebrew text that speaks about the hope someday when swords will be beaten or transformed into plowshares. In other words, swords with the metal out of which swords are made would be made into weapons to cultivate the soil. Beating swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. And spears would be used or transformed into pruning hooks, hooks that are used to prune trees that produce fruit. A time when nation will not lift up a sword against other nations, and people will cease to learn. People will cease to learn and be taught about war. The implication is they'll be taught about peace. So Dan Parasu, the acts of generosity. And then what is the lance or the spear of the warrior? And so I'll pick up from there, because it's a really interesting answer that he gives here again. Buddhi Sakti Prachanda, intelligence or reason, is the spear of the virtuous warrior. We'll continue there. We are, in fact, meeting. Hopefully, I can hoping to finish this discussion next week, and I'll pick up there from Tulsidas's discussion of the spear or the lance in the chariot of virtue, Dharma, Ratha. So I stop here this morning. We've used up our hour together, but maybe a couple of minutes in case you had any questions or comments, and then we'll conclude with prayer.
Anant?
Prasannaji, go ahead.
Yeah, with regard to dana,
yes.
I'm reminded of chapter 18, Moksha Sannyasa Yoga, where Krishna says there are three things you should never abandon. The three duties are yajna, dana, and tapas.
Yes.
Yajna is the duty we have towards God. Dana is the duty we have towards other people. And tapas is the duty we have towards ourselves. Austerity in our own lives, generosity towards others, faith in God. These three you should never abandon, is what Krishna says in chapter 18.
Yeah, that's excellent, and you see, I'm glad you lifted that verse up, Prasannaji, because they also, you see that the focus inward, let's say tapas and yajna, are balanced by dana, which is the focus outward by the generosity. And I think this is always, it is a consistent characteristic of the Hindu tradition that I've noted and always spoken about. And this comes back to my point about being both givers and receivers. In fact, if you look at the structure of Hindu worship, at puja or traditional rituals, one always gave before one received. So we, for example, we come to the temple and we bring something to offer as prasad. We give, and after we receive. So we give and then we receive. We're being both givers and receivers, but in our rituals, giving precedes receiving. We receive at the end. We give at the beginning, and we receive at the end as prasada. But there's one question, we are all receivers. You should think that the question of, we don't have a choice to be a receiver. Think of your body. We have received our bodies from earth. We receive our breath from the air. We don't see without the light of the sun. It is the relationship between the light of the sun and the mechanism of the eye that enables sight. We don't learn speech outside of a community of human beings who speak. We don't have knowledge without teachers. We are all receivers. We can't help to be receivers. We cannot be human beings outside of a community of human beings. But unfortunately, we can be selfish human beings. We can receive without giving. And in fact, Bhagavad Gita, Prasanna, you'd remember that verse where Sri Krishna says that one who receives also without giving is a thief. So let us conclude.